First-person platforming. Good introduction, right? Everyone who outright dislikes it can just tune out everything that follows, since Deadcore is non-stop start-to-finish first-person platforming, with a focus on challenging set pieces and stages designed for speedrunning. You do shoot stuff as well, but really that's just to enable further platforming. I seem to be in a minority that really enjoys it, so bear that in mind going ahead into this video. I also want to note that this video is not going to be me saying that you're wrong for not liking it, because, well, that'd be insane. I'm not blind to the issues it brings. A first-person perspective restricts a game from doing a lot of things a third-person or a 2D game can do, and Deadcore reminded me of that more than anything else, since a lot of the negative things I do have to say about this game come from Deadcore forgetting this. Deadcore doesn't really fix the issues that this perspective brings, and I'm not sure it even really tries to, but it's fun besides that, and it did essentially give me what I wanted in a first-person platformer. The game opens up with us falling from a great height, and seemingly having not learned whatever we were supposed to up there, we immediately begin climbing back up. And that's about all the story we'll be getting for a good while that you don't get in a collectible text log. Plus, it really is all you need. I mean, if you fall down some stairs you were scaling, odds are you'll have another crack at it. If you do care about the logs, it's mostly cryptic stuff about going home, how hellish it is in here, how awful respawning is, the fact that we might be some kind of hologram, and maybe the universe is ending. But hey, at least they have net access. At the time of reviewing this, I haven't found all the logs. Ooh, that doesn't bode well. The controls are your standard FPS fare, and the feeling of movement is perfectly fit for purpose. For starters, there is no sprint button. You accelerate to a decent clip near instantly, and you maintain that top speed. Some areas can still feel a little bit large, but later unlocks to your moveset mitigate this feeling somewhat. You have an absolute ton of mid-air control, but you do also feel a little bit floaty. While I have misjudged jumps completely, for the most part you can steer and correct yourself, even halting and reversing your course mid-jump. But it still feels different from controlling on the ground thanks to momentum, so it's not just a cop-out. That floatiness is a good and a bad thing. On the one hand, it does give you that element of course correction and make the environment feel decently alien. On the other hand, I have hovered slowly downwards, just so I can land and progress. I wish I had a button to quickly accelerate and stomp down, just so I could keep a consistent flow through the stages better. As far as the basic control goes, this game does have a lot of stuff I couldn't clear on the first go, but it never felt like it was because the controls couldn't keep up with what I wanted to do. You do also start with a double jump, and I tend to spam double jumps in games that have them. Deadcore seemed set to break that habit. Sometimes it's more time efficient or just plain wise to use your jumps sparingly. Not to mention some segments require strict rationing of the jumps you do have. There are 5 stages with 3 more exclusive to the speedrun mode, and 4 power-ups throughout. This game is pretty short if you just want to do one run through each stage, and don't want to hunt for collectibles or replay stages to try and speedrun or explore them. If you just want to do that one run, you're not getting much playtime out of this. On my first time through, stages took me from 5 minutes to 50. The first stage quickly gives us the switch gun, so now the game is about making jumps whilst timing the switching on and off of enemies, jets, fan blades, and moving doorways. The shooting mechanics aren't exactly complicated, ammo isn't exactly plentiful, but you do get a full refill each checkpoint, and those are plentiful. I do like the implementation of the switch gun overall. I didn't at first and it took time to grow on me. You don't remove obstacles, you delay them. So in tense situations you have to keep a constant move on, because you've only put off your problems for a few seconds. This doesn't go so much for the enemies, since they only go away for about 3 seconds tops. Shooting them can feel a little pointless at times. Later on we get the dash, and yeah, it's a dash. It can be a little bit nerve-wracking in first person, trying to switch this thing off at the right time. To try and mitigate this, you do lose almost all momentum horizontally and vertically when you activate the dash, and you don't carry it once you stop dashing. So you have to be careful with it, but you can make precise jumps if you get the timing down. It is pretty useful. And the fact that momentum doesn't carry allows clever use of the dash to just dart around parts of the stage. What the cancelling of momentum means, however, is that the dash has been made for very tight line of sight puzzles. And these can be tricky in a very frustrating way, since, well, I have no relative idea how big my bloke is. The best way to get around this is to stop thinking of yourself as some kind of human, and more like a viewport. Stage 4 gives us Gravity mod. It's a purely situational addition to the switch gun, which basically adds the worst part of the game to the game. Because now we have gravity and perspective fuckery thrown into the mix, and these puzzles, well, I call them that, they're not really puzzles, run the gambit from unintrusive but not really fun, to irritating and poorly designed. At times, they just function as a way to make an otherwise standard challenge timed, by virtue of the fact that you're now walking around lasers while suspended over a pit. In that case, it's generally okay. A lot of the challenges in this game give you absolutely no time spare, so bear that in mind, it wants you going at its pace. And the gravity mod parts are perhaps the most strict, sometimes annoyingly so. Lastly, on the final stage we get Blast. It can instantly charge generators, hit multiple enemies, and it can function as a rocket jump. It's not entirely handy, but can be fun to use. It does rarely open up a new route, but dashes or gravity mod routes do most of the heavy lifting in that regard. It does make one kind of enemy you run into 3 times in the final stage a bit easier though. As a matter of fact, the first time I played the final level, I immediately took an alternate route offered to me and completely missed the power-up. I had to go back for the poor neglected bugger. The overall collection of power-ups is basically 2 hits and 2 misses, and even then the dash isn't that good until you find the hidden power-ups for it. So, the controls are good and the unlocks so-so, ranging from good to nothing. But even that isn't worth much if you don't have a good playground for them. Well, the levels themselves are decently designed, and it's clear that the developers did really want to deliver some fun jumps, and they did make some unique set pieces. And some of them are then repeated an awful lot because hey, it's connective tissue. That is a little bit unfair. There are a good few unique set pieces, and the ones that are reused are often remixed in new ways. Stages 1 and 2 are almost purely platforming based, being built around jumps, the switch gun, and then combining the two. Obviously they're the most easy stages, but due to their more narrow focus, are also some of the more fun to speedrun in my mind. Stages 3 and 4 are more built around the gimmick of whichever power-up they introduced on that stage, so dashing and gravity mod respectively. Despite the fact I did end up liking the dash, Stage 3, its introduction, seemed pretty desperate to make me hate it. And then it was upgraded and everything was hunky-dory. Stage 3 itself became far more enjoyable. 4? Well, it's non-stop gravity puzzles. By far and away the dullest, trickiest, and least enjoyable stage for me. Now, not all of this stage is bad, but the worst puzzles are so egregiously awful that it overshadowed everything else. Like, even if I made it up to the top there, I do not have any time spare, even if I dashed all the way through. Luckily I learned on my second time around, these puzzles are completely avoidable if you take different routes, and the difference in quality is staggering. 5 does tie up everything nicely. Trickier but still basic jumping sections from the earlier stages, alongside gravity wells that are not half as annoying as the prior levels somehow. And of course, a lot more use of the dash. Stage 5 creates a very satisfying back and forth. You have to scale to power conduits to turn on the lift up the tower, and then work your way back to it. It's a small touch, but I really like how these segments let you dart through them backwards, while still being tricky uphill struggles to the conduits. The difficulty of this game does fluctuate a little bit on a moment-to-moment level. Some individual sections took me a great deal of attempts before I cleared them, while I just breezed through others. It's sometimes through luck, skill, or them just being plain easier. The stages offer multiple routes, not just hidden ones. At times they divert right in front of you, and some ways are both easier and faster, which makes things a pretty simple choice when you're aiming for time. Some of the more frustrating parts, however, well, I didn't feel satisfied when I cleared them, more just relieved that they were done with. You only have one hit point. Laser gates and fan blades kill you, bottomless pits are everywhere, laser walls are everywhere, enemy robots are everywhere. The freedom of movement and safety measures you have in the double jump and dashing are counterbalanced nicely against very close shave set pieces and deadly jumps. And while some deaths did feel unfair due to not having near enough time, lack of situational awareness, or just plain throwing you into a deadly situation facing the wrong direction, a lot of the time it was down to poor timing or a bad move. If you are taking your time enjoying the sights and just taking every bit as it comes, it's still a fun game, and a fair bit easier. It's when you start aiming for part times and figuring out how best to navigate the stage as a whole that it gets both harder and way more rewarding. You do have infinite respawns, and you're dropped back into the action instantly. Hitting the R key also instantly resets you, so if you make a misstep you can immediately start over. Checkpoints are also plentiful, so in a stage you never lose too much progress. This does kind of lead to a repetitive flow through the stages that can be noticed. A tricky obstacle or three followed by some relatively simple jumps and then a checkpoint. The game is having a laugh with those simple jumps. It knows you are sweating bullets after clearing the hard segment, trying to make very easy leaps. As mentioned previously, there are multiple routes through the stages. Sometimes this is just two different challenges, but at times it does divert between shorter, harder challenges versus longer, safer ones, which makes for a good balance and it does aid in replayability, especially as you maintain those extra moves you unlock as you replay old stages, which not only aids with the hard bits, but opens up even more routes entirely, both intended and otherwise, and a lot of the fun I had was clambering atop the set pieces to just see how much of the stage I could play on top of. It even made for fun platforming onto itself. Seriously, the stages are so well packed with hidden routes and things to go back for, those story logs, music tracks you can get for the speedrun mode. I mean, you have to unlock the more up-tempo stuff, which is a shame because the set picks for the stages, they feel a little bit slow, weirdly understated, and they didn't really grab me. Meanwhile, the unlockable stuff is suitably energetic. Sparks, which unlock even more routes through the stages, and of course upgrades to your abilities. There are ample ways through and on top of the levels, and you're rewarded for seeking them out. Not all of it is incredibly well thought out, however. Going back to moaning about Stage 4, there were two puzzles I actually didn't beat. In fact, before I did beat them, the game fucked up in both cases and accidentally flung me through them. In one of those cases, it was a very good thing, because this is the worst room in the entire game. You have to do a ton of things in a very exact sequence while gravity fucks with you, and you have to do it with absolutely zero time spare. I can't tell if you can beat this thing legitimately, and I'm not going back to find out. I have nothing but bad memories of this room, and I don't really want to add to them. I've been trying to avoid the word puzzle, since nothing in this game is really a brainbuster. I bring this up because of how switch-heavy it is. And that last room, well, it wasn't really a puzzle. Everything's more down to reflexes, timing, and having a decent grasp of the controls and abilities at your disposal and using them in sequence. Setting off switches at the last possible second is a must, especially with those gravity puzzles, since throughout most of the game, you barely have any time. It seems very strict. Deadcore will often let you analyse a situation before jumping into it. This does lead to stages feeling a little bit segmented, but it isn't to say that challenges don't flow together. That flow isn't always a great thing, mind. Some challenges do feel a little out of sync. Timing that works for one part of the puzzle just means you're jumping to almost certain death in the next, creating a sort of awkward flow that you can't see ahead of time and thus prepare for. Very few of the set pieces suffer from this, but in those cases you need lightning reflexes, or to have just done this already to see it coming. I haven't really talked about big problems with first-person platforming that Deadcore doesn't really fix, however. As always, you have far less situational awareness than a 2D or third-person game. It's easier to make jumps in these perspectives because it's way easier not to only make one or two jumps and then consistently gauge them, but you know exactly how big you are relative to the rest of the world. Plus, you can tell when a platform is beneath you without having to look down, so you can just focus on what's ahead. First-person platforming can't do this as well. Gauging jumps in first person is definitely harder to get down, you've got more factors to take into account. The amount of aerial correction you have does counter this problem somewhat, but sections that require moving through tight spaces or dodging things can feel a little bit finicky at times, because how tall or wide you are isn't immediately clear. And I just never really had a problem with lining up jumps. It's part of why I really enjoyed Dying Light. I can't tell you why I haven't had a problem with it, since I've never had a problem with it. It's harder to quantify because I can't see both sides of the issue as well. These differing camera perspectives also have an easier time directing the player. The camera can assure that the player will know which way is progress. In first person, the game has to hope you're looking in the right direction. This is really not helped by the fact that everything in Deadcore looks exactly the same. It's geometrically shaped metals floating in a void, held together by nothing and lasers. It's a pretty void to be sure, but still a void. When alternate routes rejoin, it's hard to tell at times which is actually the way forwards. This is why I dislike a majority of the gravity sections. Everything looks the same, everything's floating in a void, and I have to very quickly jump from well to well, and each time you enter a well, your view is violently spun around relative to your position outside of it. So you lose focus on whatever the hell you were looking at when you got into the well. Taking all of this into account, it's trickier than you'd think to remember which way is actually down, and that fucks with you a lot more than you'd think. At best, I adapted to how gravity wells mess with you. I tolerated them on the way to better things. I don't want the game to handhold me so I can never get lost, but it should do more with how the level looks to point you where you should be going. The lack of situational awareness isn't always a detriment, however. It can add an intensity to certain parts of the game, where you know you have to keep moving, make jumps, keep an eye on the way forward, but you're at least keenly aware of the presence of enemies and instant kill obstacles. It forces you to observe, memorize, and move very quickly. This is a very simple section that nonetheless tripped me up, and it showcases this rather well. You're only really dealing with 3 factors: the lasers, timing your jumps around the lasers, and those floating pusher cubes. Oh, and I guess, you know, the bottomless pit beneath you, I kind of forgot about that. Make that 4 factors. You can't always keep an eye on all of them, so your best bet is to quickly check each thing and keep fucking moving, because staying still will disintegrate you. The enemies aren't really that noteworthy, but overall I dislike the majority of them. Of the 4, there is only one I think is handled quite well. The most basic enemy is a floating cube. They maneuver slowly towards you, and on contact send you violently flying off, often into a waiting laser. The turrets are pretty good, they're the one enemy I quite like. They fire often enough to be a threat without being overbearing, and it's a projectile that you can see and dodge. However, they predict, so you will be sent off course. It's a decent threat that forces you to quickly reevaluate, but can still screw you over if you're not being cautious. This floating horde enemy is best described as a pest. They get close, slow you down, and screw with your vision. You can switch them all off by targeting the leading bastard, but that only buys you a couple of seconds. These enemies are typically placed to blindside you, or at least it feels that way. Lastly, there are these laser spinning things. They only turn up a handful of times in the final stage, and, well, I guess they're annoying, they're incredibly accurate. And not to mention, they will kill you at extremely long distances, and occasionally, or at least on one occasion, I'm not sure if it was a glitch, it followed me to the checkpoint directly above, and just killed me over and over again. And I didn't notice. I thought it was just sniping me. The main issue is to do with how enemies are handled in conjunction with everything else. Dealing with predictable obstacles that you can memorize and plan routes against is fine. Enemies are a rogue element, and with the first-person perspective, it can become overload. Particularly because, as I mentioned long ago, you don't defeat enemies, you delay them, and you only get a few precious seconds. They don't break the game or anything, but they aren't fun enough to warrant how annoying they can be. A lot of my biggest grievances with this game came about on my first playthrough, and actually went away in my second, so I'm trying to balance out, my critique of this game. It's no surprise that a second time around will lead to a faster and more fluid experience, but putting what you've learned to use in the levels is genuinely rewarding here. Deadcore is a short game. The first time through took me 2 hours and 19 minutes to reach the final room. If you just want to quickly play through it and move on, 2 hours is all you're getting. I'm only basing that on myself, mind. It was quick, fun, deadly, and occasionally frustrating. I did replay stages, however, both to explore them for goodies and hidden routes, and also to beat them as quickly as I could, putting those things I'd found to use. I enjoyed doing both immensely. The stages are expansive enough to do both very well, and when I did replay the story later on, I shaved a full hour off of my playtime. I took alternate routes and made full use of everything I'd learned, and the items I unlocked only added additional routes to the stages I'd already beaten. With that said, you've got to bear in mind, I shaved an hour off doing alternate routes that I hadn't touched before. These weren't always routes locked off by power-ups either, these were branching parts of the original stage. Even with the lack of foresight, I still got through them much faster. I mean, I did have a far better grasp on the controls, but that can't account for all of it. Some ways through the levels are just plain quicker and easier. My replay of Stage 4 was a completely different beast. Seriously, some of these are actually 2 or 3 stages in one. You'll miss about half of the game if you only play through it once. It's ultimately a positive and a negative that the power-ups let you completely skip certain obstacles. On the one hand, it is a little bit cheap, but on the other hand, they have accounted for it in certain places, so it's unclear just when the developers don't want you scaling atop the stage, or whether they just forget to put lasers everywhere. On the positive side of things, it means the power-ups actually feel pretty powerful. There's also something rather charming about this completely alien environment not being completely infallible. If you do want to get proper into speedrunning this game, as in top the charts and not just go for personal bests, well, the leaderboards aren't exactly well maintained. I'm not claiming all of these are illegitimate, okay? Let's just put that out there now. Regardless, it's a barrier I do not have the skill or patience to cross. 36 seconds is bloody impressive, I couldn't do that. I'd have a bit more trouble, however, beating this stellar record of 0 seconds flat. And I will admit, I'm a little bit skeptical of the guy who cleared this level 32 minutes before he started it. I just want to jump around a bit, but Deadcore, bastard that it is, made me want to do it faster. It's an undoubtedly flawed game, but it did give me what I wanted, and a little bit more I didn't expect.